Hi, everyone, and welcome to my Philosophy of Inclusive Education assignment for SPED 450. Before I get into my philosophy, I would like to start out by talking about some personal experiences that have shaped who I am today as a person and my beliefs about teaching and education. So, in August of 2014, the special education program was introduced at my middle school. And I was in the 8th grade and a part of a welcome program where we welcomed all of the new students. We worked very closely with the special education program, and I happened to form great relationships with all of the students and staff. Before becoming a TA for their class, I was called out of class often to help students get on the bus to go home or calm them down so they can return to class because the teachers and aides were unsuccessful. Once I became an aide, my most memorable moment was teaching a student the difference between a zero and a circle in the span of 10 minutes. And the instructors have not been able to do this with this student. And this was in April of 2015. So a ton of time has passed since the beginning of the school year. So they thought that it was really incredible that I was able to do that in the span of about 10 minutes. And this was what made me realize I wanted to go into SPED. Moving on to my next experience, I was an observer slash volunteer in a kindergarten classroom at the Fairplex Child Development Center for a class I actually took last semester in undergrad. In a whole group setting, I often helped check students' work on assignments. I read books to students in small groups and then asked them questions. I talked to them about their everyday life, played games with them, and during my last week, I facilitated a whole group activity for those who wanted to participate. As you can see with the first three pictures, those were some of the student samples from the activity I did. The bottom picture is different areas in the classroom that are done after school hours, and usually students will have a review question, and once their name is called and they answer the question correctly, they can place where they want to be in the classroom as long as it doesn't exceed the number listed on the board. In this inclusive education setting, there were two SPED students. One of the students had ADHD. One of the things I often saw was that the student would sit near a teacher at all times during whole group instruction and activities because they needed constant stimulation to be able to maintain their attention and focus on what was being taught. The student also worked better individually with one on one support rather than in groups. The student also would sit by themselves during individual activities as a whole group. So, as you can see with the pictures below, one of the art projects they did was a balloon dog. This student was having one on one support by having me next to him to ensure that he was staying on task. This first picture to the bottom left was what he originally created, but the teacher came by and told him that it was wrong and it needed to be fixed. With some adult support, he was able to put his dog back together the right way. This next student was probably the one I worked with the most in this classroom. This student was diagnosed with developmental delays at a young age. During instruction, she often was off to the side, doing a lot of differentiated and one on one instruction. She often had guidance from one of the assistant instructors or myself to help model what to do during certain activities. Some of the activities she did focused on fine motor skills and cognition, but a lot of the activities that I was a part of focused more on language and letter recognition. A lot of these activities were either hands on activities or activities that used sensory supports. She also had curriculum modifications and adaptations, as well as accommodations if needed, as per what was stated in her IEP. So, when looking at the picture in the top left box, that was the same balloon dog project I mentioned earlier that the whole class did. A curriculum modification that was made for this assignment was that the teachers had the shapes drawn out for the student to cut out and focus on her fine motor skills. When looking at the pictures in the top right box, that was when they were making seed bombs outside. This student needed constant adult support so she would know what she was doing throughout the activity. In the box at the bottom left, that was one of the matching activities I did with her. And in this activity, she was tasked with finding uppercase and lowercase letters that were the same and saying the letter as she grabbed them. Once she started getting a bunch of letters correctly, she was asked to put them in sequential order. Lastly, in this box to the bottom right, this was another activity I did with the student. She was tasked with sorting uppercase and lowercase letters and putting them in charts and saying the letters as she went on in the activity. With that said, here is my philosophy of education. When going through the readings, I noticed that there were a couple of philosophies that stood out to me. With that said, my philosophy is more of an eclectic approach, focusing on components of both romanticism and progressivism. As a future educator, it's important to be able to recognize collaboration, cooperation, trust, equality and diversity, positivity, amongst other things. With that said, romanticism and progressivism philosophies also promote that quality education can recognize the role of the whole child and putting them first, as well as the educator, technology, diversity, and learning environments. So, there are many theories that I've learned throughout the years in terms of child development, education, and special ed, but there are three that stood out to me the most. The first one that I would incorporate in my classroom is the Montessori method, which focuses on hands on learning through self discovery and exploration. Examples of how I would include this in my classroom include doing different science experiments in the classroom in small groups after learning about a different science topic each week, depicting a story through the form of performing arts by having students pick roles and read the character they decided to pick. And another one includes using manipulatives during math while learning about three-dimensional shapes. The next component of what I would include in my classroom is collaborative learning, which focuses on individual accountability and leadership and being able to work with others as well as promote meaningful learning. Some examples of this that I would include in my classroom include think, pair, share, project based learning, peer teaching, peer editing, and group activities and discussions. Lastly, the most important component of theoretical base that I would implement in my classroom is culturally responsive teaching. Culturally responsive teaching requires developing a culturally diverse knowledge by being able to recognize differences and know that every child is unique. Some examples of culturally responsive teaching that I would implement in my classroom include diagnostic interviews, guest speakers, call and response, media, learning stations, and implementing other students' vocabulary into lessons. For this next section, it will be focusing on teaching and learning. It is really important when using an eclectic approach to be able to incorporate pedagogical foundations and assessment strategies through using different learning styles to ensure support for all students in their learning environments. With that said, meaningful learning can be explored through technology, project based learning, and scaffolding. With regards to technology, our world is constantly changing, which means advancements in technology are exponentially increasing every year. This makes it even more important for students to be able to have a foundation in using technology. A way I would incorporate technology in my classroom is have students do some sort of online game or activity after a lesson, as well as incorporate assistive technology for those who may need it. Another component I would incorporate in my classroom is scaffolding. With instructional scaffolding, it's a concept where teacher will add supports for students in order to enhance their learning and aid in the mastery of tasks. As the student begins to master the assigned task, supports will gradually be removed. This is often done through modeling. Lastly, for project based learning, it's an approach that focuses on students identifying a real world problem through research and being able to develop a solution through presenting it in a multimedia approach. This is often done through a holistic approach, which often deals with rubrics. For this next section, it will be focusing on embracing differences. I'd like to start off with a quote. Just because a PC isn't running Windows doesn't mean it's broken. This quote by Steve Silberman speaks volumes by saying that just because a student may be neurodiverse doesn't mean that they aren't any different than others. With that said, CRT and embracing differences correlate together. As Marino and Green state, in order to meet the needs of diverse student populations, educators will benefit through having a professional cultural understanding of the systemic U.S. public school structure as well as practical skills. With that said, going back to the idea of culturally responsive teaching, it's important to recognize that cultural knowledge is way more than just ethnicity, language, and religion. Areas of difference can include ability, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and even family structure. So it is even more important to be able to embrace these differences in education and promote equality and multiculturalism in the classroom. For these next couple of slides, I will be going further into detail on some areas of difference. So, with regards to disabilities, Section 300.8 under IDEA states that there are 13 disabilities, which include hearing impairment, autism spectrum disorder, specific learning disability, traumatic brain injury, deaf blindness, multiple disabilities, other health impairment, vision impairment, emotional/behavioral disabilities, deafness, orthopedic impairment, intellectual disabilities, and speech and language impairment. In order to be able to promote inclusive practices, it's important to be able to embrace these differences. Some important components of inclusive education that I would implement in my classroom are universal designs of learning, appropriate accommodations and modifications, evidence based practices, developmentally appropriate practices, as well as promoting the idea of acceptance and equality. In the end, it's important to recognize that all students are entitled to a free and appropriate public education under IDEA. For this next section, I will be focusing on people learning English as a second language. So, English learners are often characterized as people learning English as a second language. They often have trouble adapting to their learning environment due to language barriers. With that said, there are a ton of common accommodations and modifications used in order to try and eliminate the language barriers. Most of these include more time on an assignment, instructions in both English and the student's primary language, listening to books in both the primary language and English for better understanding, having an interpreter, and even learning important terms and vocabulary in both English and the student's primary language prior to learning about that topic in class. Furthermore, it's important to note that as a future educator that is wanting to go into ESL and SPED, it's important to be able to embrace these differences and not equate an English language learner as someone who may have a disability because you can't assume anything. Lastly, another important topic relevant to news recently in our world is the LGBTQ plus community. These This community consists of people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or others. Although there have been tons of progress and strides towards equality and acceptance for this population, there's a ton of issues and concerns happening in our society today, some of which have to do with schools and bullying. So, with that said, it's important to be able to embrace these differences and promote advocacy in the classroom. Some of these ways include making the classroom environment and learning environment a safe place for all. Another one could be implementing policies that protect everyone in the classroom. Another one could be using media or literacy in the classroom. Lastly, another informational component to think about is to deepen your knowledge on the topic, to be able to advocate and be an ally for the LGBTQ community. For this last section, I'll be focusing on conflict and collaboration. When it comes to any student, it's important to involve families. With that said, collaboration is one of the most important qualities in a family environment involvement. Some examples include maintaining and building relationships with families, which could be having the parent include input on their child's IEP and writing the goals and objectives together as a group. That way, the meeting provides an opportunity to facilitate collaboration between not only the educators and parents, but also the students or any other immediate family that may be in attendance at the meeting. Another important component is communication. When communicating with families of students with disabilities, all personnel should consider family members as a resource, which, as stated recently, it's important to provide and obtain input when it comes to planning and problem solving. On the other hand, conflict can also occur when involving families. Some ways to approach potential conflict could include making sure to create expectations to avoid conflict, making sure to have clear communication and be on the same page. And most importantly, allow each party to say their thoughts. There's not always a wrong or right answer when it comes to giving input. With that said, it is also important to note that family involvement and student involvement are just as important as anything else when it comes to the special education process, which is the highlight of why it is important for there to be more inclusive education settings and for there to be more knowledge on the subject for people who may not know. Here's my references page.